the established order during the First World War. We have been probing for some explanation of why it happened and what it signified for those left-wing organizations in advanced capitalist societies which claim the so-called socialist revolution as their objective. But if you stop and reflect for a moment, then you realize that our inquiry really is about a certain number of other large, perplexing, and continuous problems. We're talking about the kinds of questions that our very good comrades Francis Piven and Nick Flowers raised in their provocative book, Poor People's Movements. Whether, after all, left-wing organizations in advanced capitalist societies inevitably become integrated into the established order. Whether the very growth in the bureaucracy and in the presence of those organizations gives them a vested interest in the system, albeit as the institutionalized opposition. Whether, in fact, they become much more apt as bargaining agencies inside the system rather than as engines of insurrection against the system. Now, in effect, we have said and argued that neither of the very forcefully held opinions about the sacred union really is a proper explanation. That, after all, it is much too simplistic to attribute that very great strategic reorientation of the working class movement either to the so-called patriotic fidelity of the working class masses or to the very rabid opportunism and venality of certain trade union and socialist leaders. Instead, we would argue that the modalities of class collaboration which the sacred union embodied really reflected much less a sharp reach with past practice than they did the culmination of tendencies which had been maturating in the organized socialist and syndicalist movements over the decade before 1914. We're talking in the first place about the tendency toward social integration, characterized especially by that small harvest of social reforms and by occasional wage increases through trade union pressure, all of which serve to attenuate somewhat the radical alienation of the working class masses. And we're talking in the second place about the tendency toward large, stable organizations anchored to permanent bureaucracies, which show themselves to have a greater aptitude for wrenching concessions occasionally from the established order than the aptitude for struggling against that established order. Consider, if you please, the bottom line, that what really was the missing link in the whole chain of events that led to the 4th of August of 1914 was the authentic Revolutionary Party. So that all of that radical rhetoric, which was the stock in trade of the unions and the socialist parties before 1914, concealed a practice which was neither revolutionary nor Marxist. That in essence, if one were to look for the exception to that rule, one would have to search precisely where orthodox Marxists habitually said a working class revolution could never take place, in Russia, a country economically underdeveloped and only at the very doorstep of capitalist development. Consider for a moment the most glaring and conspicuous and revealing missing point. We're talking, of course, about the pre-war history of that great German Social Democratic Party. A history, if you please, that speaks volumes about the self-delusion of the Second International before 1914. A history that speaks volumes about contemporary mass working class organizations like the French Communist Party that carve out a niche for themselves in the established society and are loath to risk their organization in a confrontation with the system itself. Remember that the Social Democratic Party of Germany prided itself on being the guardian of Marxism in the Second International. A party that utterly was fanatical in its devotion to that schematic, that mechanistic variation of Marxism, which Karl Kautsky, the authoritative theorist of the Social Democratic Party, propounded virtually every day of his life. A party which beat back the challenge of so-called revisionism over and again at Congress after Congress. Those revisionists being out-and-out reformists who openly and without equivocation, and rather honestly, as a matter of fact, demanded that the party scrap from its program all of that Marxist claptrap and bring the program into line with what the actual daily practice of the party was. But no, the orthodox Marxist majority in the German Social Democratic Party would not have that. They much preferred the self-delusion of radical talk to cover their reformist action. So that though the verbiage was always very radical, though the terminology was Marxist, that party persistently backed away from anything resembling direct mass action. Scan, if you please, the history of that German Social Democratic Party between 1900 and 1914, and you realize that the intense debate of 1905 and 6 over the general strike and the sharp repudiation of the general strike by the leadership really defined the narrow limits within which that party would and could operate. The SPD Congress of Vienna in 1905, September of that year, transpired under the powerful influence of the sensational upheaval in Russia that year, when the Russian people demonstrated for all to see the force and the power of direct mass action. As a result, it should hardly surprise us that an insurgent left-wing faction appeared at that German Socialist Congress of 1905, inspired by and spearheaded by the indomitable Rosa Luxemburg, for whom the time of the gap between talk and action was over, for whom it was necessary to act big if you were going to talk big. Remember that from the fall of 1904 already, Rosa Luxemburg was getting fed up, was getting anxious, was getting impatient over the fact that the party went to Congress after Congress, denounced the right wing, denounced reformism, and then did nothing. And there it went, the SPD, to the great International Congress of Amsterdam in August of 1904. And before the whole world parliament of socialism denounced and degraded reformism and pushed through a resolution against it. And then what? And was the verbiage followed by anything? And so Rosa wrote to her very great friend, the Dutch militant, Henrietta Roland-Post, in October of 1904, and she expressed her impatience and her anxiety at this kind of décalage. I am not in the least happy about the role which our so-called orthodox Marxist leadership has played, chasing after each opportunistic pair and yapping critical advice doesn't satisfy me. In fact, I'm sick and tired of all this pure talk. For a revolutionary movement, not to move forward is to go back. The only means of struggle against opportunism isn't to scold reformists, but to move forward oneself, constantly enlarging the range of tactics. Thus, at the Congress of Jena in September of 1905, Rosa and her comrades leveled a tremendous attack upon the paralyzing inactivity, the paralyzing inertia of the party, and demanded mass tactics, demanded direct mass action. Now, obviously, the trade union bosses and the party leaders had no inclination for it. And they counterattacked. And they said that they had built great and beautiful and powerful organizations and that they would not risk them in adventures that would invite repression. And Rosa then reposted in words that you should know, because it is at the heart of her being as a political animal. And it is that organizations may be great and beautiful and powerful on paper, but they have no test until they are in action. That there is no sense of what their power is until they have been through the ordeal by fire. That after all, it is that action, it is that struggle that makes organizations and makes them strong. Will you finally learn from the Russian Revolution, she said. There the masses were driven into widespread direct action. They started without any organization, but in the course of their struggle, step by step, they built and strengthened their organization. The point is that you don't have strong organizations in advance without the ordeal of struggle. All that is mechanical, undialectical nonsense. Strong organization comes only out of struggle in the process of clarifying the class struggle. Needless to say, such arguments did not persuade the trade union bosses, who anyway despised an intellectual like Rosa Luxemburg and a frail Jewish woman to boot. And August Bebel, who was the top president of the German Social Democratic Party, and his cohort in the executive had no sympathy for mass tactics either, which they derided over and again as anarchist and adventurist and putschist. And yet, at Jena, in September of 1905, for the one and only time, Bebel and the party executive relented somewhat and supported a motion and pushed it through, which committed the SPD to a very mild, watered-down version of the general strike, but nonetheless, the general strike. Because you see, at that very moment in 1905, a good sector of the German ruling class had decided that it was time to emasculate universal suffrage, through which the Social Democrats were getting too visible and too powerful a presence in the parliament. And had that ploy worked, then the very foundation of the electoral strategy of social democracy would have been destroyed, and the leadership couldn't accept that. And so they supported this motion for a general strike. But note it well, not a general strike in an offensive sense against the system, but a defensive general strike to be invoked by the SPD when and if the ruling class decided to curtail universal suffrage. And even that slight shift in the electoralist and trade unionist orientation of the SPD was too much for the trade union bosses. And a year later, at the Congress of Mannheim in September of 1906, they threw their weight around and had their way. Remember, after all, that they had enrolled over 2 million men and women in the German trade unions, and that mass constituted most of the votes that SPD candidates got at elections, so that the trade union bosses had leverage in the party, so that they could negotiate as they did, secretly and behind the scenes, with the party leaders, so that by the time the Mannheim Congress was held, the conclusion was a foregone one, that Rosa and her friends would be crushed. And so at Mannheim, the trade union bosses stated their conditions, and the orthodox Marxist majority, shepherded by Babel, swallowed it whole. That the trade union bosses, or specifically the executive committee of the Federation of German Trade Unions, would have a veto power over any question of substance that came before the Social Democratic Party. That in effect, any or every proposal for the general strike would be dead before it was even laid on the table. That even that mild commitment, which had been made at the Congress of Jena, would be a dead letter. That mass tactics would disappear forever from the agenda of the German Social Democratic Party. The point is, you see, that the so-called distinction between the revisionist right and the Marxist center of the German Social Democratic Party was false. That all of those party secretaries and newspaper editors and municipal councilors and co-op managers, all of those bureaucrats who managed over the socialist ghetto in Germany, were reformists to the core and had no greater interest than to ameliorate the lot of workers within the existing society. The point is that the party leadership and the apparatus, like the top brass and the officialdom of the contemporary French Communist Party, in no way would move beyond the patriotic and cultural norms of bourgeois society. And how that resonates in my head, having after all been an observer close and first-hand of that French Communist Party for the past 25 years, and how it was in the 50s, when we were all in some struggle on behalf of the Algerians for their independence from France, and to watch that Communist Party at that time refuse to say the word Algerian independence, to hold back from that great struggle which so divided the French population. And I went to dinner one night with Harvey, who was the chief counsel at that time for the General Confederation of Labor, communist-led, himself a prominent communist, and I said, for God's sake, I don't understand it. Where is the party in this struggle? 4 years of it had gone on already, and still not a word, Libération Algérienne, from the communist press. Where and why? And he said, but you see, the masses are colonialist and chauvinist, and we cannot get ahead of them. And I said, but you've been in business for 40 years, and if you have enrolled the masses, where have you been? And why are they still colonialist and still racist. And just as in May of '68, when the party was there and said no, it could not support that cultural revolution for women's liberation, for gay rights, for all kinds of sexual freedom, because after all, the sanctity of marriage and the family is where the masses were, and you have to adhere to that particular bourgeois standard. And just these 2 weeks ago, what absolutely sent me out into the streets on a long walk, the long reports in the French press of the events in Vitry, that communist suburb of Paris, where, after all, the state had settled 300 immigrant workers from Mali in a housing settlement, and the neighbors, all good communist rank and file, protested, didn't want those black Malians living next to them, and consequently rioted, and at the head of the riot, the communist mayor of Vitry. But it was all the same in that pre-war Social Democratic Party, and it is the mold out of which these things come. And so what they learned from those parliamentary elections of 1907, that after all, if elections are the way of prestige and power, if elections are the road to power, as the party said, then it could never stray very far from the path of patriotism. Why? Those elections of 1907 in Germany are what we call the Hottentot elections. Since 1904, the German imperial government had been engaged in one of those beastly, really genocidal, ethnocidal wars in Southwest Africa, eliminating the native indigenous Hottentot population. And the Social Democratic Party had attacked that imperialism and had defended the Hottentots. And so when the parliamentary elections of 1907 came, their bourgeois opponents used that effectively and purposively against them, called the SPD the anti-German party, and hence the anti-patriotic party. And the ploy worked. For the first time in 30 years, since 1877, when the SPD began to contest in elections, it lost a percentage of the popular vote, and it lost deputies in the Reichstag, the deputation decreasing from 81 to 42. And so the lessons of those 1907 elections were glaring and obvious, that the Social Democratic Party could never stray from the path of patriotism, that it could never move much beyond the cultural and the patriotic norms of bourgeois society. So there, in September of 1907, at its Congress of Essen, they are the orthodox Marxists of the leadership and of the majority who stand and applaud when that ultra-right-wing social democrat, Gustav Noske, is at the tribune and shrieking his patriotism and saying that social democrats will support the fatherland to the hilt if it is ever attacked by Russia. Note it well, it is the same Gustav Noske who would be there in the German government in January of 1919 to mastermind the destruction of the revolutionary left in Germany, which embodied the unspeakable assassination of Rosa Luxemburg and Harvey. But it is the brilliant and relentless attack of Rosa Luxemburg upon the bureaucratic conservatism and upon the self-delusion ideologically of the Social Democratic Party, which is at the heart of the matter. For more than 6 years, Rosa Luxemburg, inside her own party, mounted a counter-offensive without compromise, without respite, which is the stuff of greatness. In part because she exposed, more plainly than any militant of her time, what the self-delusion and the calculated defeatism of the Social Democratic Party was. A strategy anchored only to electoral politics and trade union bargaining, which systematically shackled the activism of the rank and file masses and beclouded their consciousness. In part because in her own daily actions, Rosa Luxemburg embodied, without any respite or pause, that kind of exemplary courage of her revolutionary convictions. And not least of all, because she contributed a body of reflections and criticisms, not as an armchair Marxist philosopher, but out of the fronts of struggle which have lost none of their relevance and none of their immediacy. Reflections about the relationship between party leadership and the rank and file base. Reflections about the surprising, the unexpected, the infinitely creative in the processes of revolutionary action. The point of departure is late 1904, when Rosa becomes increasingly anxious and increasingly agitated about all talk and no action. Will it only be verbiage? Will it only be passivity? And then came the Russian Revolution of 1905. And suddenly Rosa saw all the problems of German social democracy in the most glaring light. For once she compared the militant activism of the Russian masses with the passivity of the German proletariat, she realized that something was very rotten in the kingdom of German social democracy. We're speaking in the first instance about her mordant insight into the bureaucratic weight in that party and the conservative influence of the apparatus upon its strategy. Once she had returned from the fighting fronts of Russia in 1906, Rosa Luxemburg composed her brilliant tract called The Mass Strike, in which she singled out no group for more severe and bitter attack than the trade union chiefs affiliated to the party, whom she accused in effect of being guardians of the established order. In one searing passage after another, she charged that those union chiefs looked upon their organizations as ends in themselves, that in no way would they risk those unions in a mass confrontation with the established order, that they were really men of social peace rather than of class war. They were the tacticians of minor economic skirmishes and not the great strategists of social revolution. That they prided themselves on the small gains which their unions had got for their members through periodic partial strikes, gains which were not only ephemeral, but which, Rosa Luxemburg charge, curtained the workers off from an overview of the whole society and the processes of exploitation which propelled it. In Piven and Clower's Poor People's Movements, in a brilliant analysis, Francis and Dick talk about how the great industrial unions in the United States, which were born out of those massive, convulsive, spontaneous workers' upheavals in the United States in the 1930s, then how they compressed the potentiality of that spontaneous, convulsive workers' upheaval into the acquisition of relatively minor wage and hour adjustments. And Piven and Clower talk about how those unions then aligned with the New Deal for social reforms, which proved to be either ephemeral or ineffective, but which managed, nonetheless, to tranquilize the workers at the very point of their most enraged class consciousness. And Rosa Luxemburg says much the same thing in her accusation against the trade unions in Germany. The trade union chiefs are absorbed in an economic guerrilla war whose task it is to make workers place the highest value on the smallest economic achievement, and thus to lose any real sense of the system as a whole. Thus, trade union leaders refer with the greatest satisfaction to the achievements of the last 15 years, instead of emphasizing the other side of the coin, that the policies and laws of the ruling classes constantly neutralize and undermine the so-called gains from 15 years of trade union struggle. In Russia, Rosa Luxemburg had seen how workers who had no organization at all plunged into action and then, in the course of their struggle, enlarged their goals and created new tactical forms. In Germany, it was the opposite. In those hierarchical, highly structured unions, the bosses rendered the rank and file passive and objected to and rejected any initiatives from below. The initiative and power of making decisions becomes devolved upon the trade union specialists, while the passive virtue of discipline and obedience belongs to the rank and file workers. From the against the mass strike tactic. And Rosa knew why they did so. Because they wouldn't risk their organizations, and they wouldn't invite repression. But that's not what they said publicly. Publicly, they said, look, we can't have a great mass strike. We can't risk that kind of action yet. It is premature. Because we have enrolled only 2 million workers, and that is not yet a statistical majority. Because we have not distributed our tracts to enough workers. Because we have not had enough practice in short, disciplined, partial strikes. And of course, with the lessons of the Russian Revolution of 1905 branded in her consciousness, Rosa Luxemburg swept away that kind of apologetics as self-serving claptrap. And she went to the heart of the matter in her repost in that brochure, in which she tells us how it is, after all, that a people develops a revolutionary class consciousness. That it never is a question of statistical majority. That it is not feasible or necessary to organize the absolute majority. that a revolutionary class consciousness emerges out of protracted struggle, that it can never emanate from surrogate kinds of struggle, like election campaigns, or like the distribution of tracts, or like short, disciplined, partial strikes, but that it has to emerge from the people themselves in a long, almost chaotic, almost dangerous kind of mass action. Listen to the way Rosa puts it. In the case of the organized, disciplined German worker, the class consciousness implanted by social democracy is theoretical and latent. In the revolution, when the masses themselves appear on the political battlefield, this class consciousness becomes practical and active. A year of revolution, listen to this sentence, a year of revolution has given the Russian proletariat the kind of training which 30 years of parliamentary and trade union struggle cannot artificially give to the German proletariat. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand it in terms of what the infectious quality of an authentic, huge, and protracted collective action is? If you had seen it firsthand, let us say in the Paris of May of 1968, if we had been there in the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 68, if we were in Warsaw today, if we were in places where that kind of thing percolates, you see, I saw it myself how those literally thousands and thousands, you could not count the number, of French people who had been totally passive and inarticulate suddenly found forces, that all of the restraints were off, all of the routine was broken, all of the traditional forms were over. And consequently, something new emerged from it, something powerful. It's only then that you scale, you see, that kind of ideological barrier that the society puts up. It is only there that you begin to invent and create new forms of self-expression. So yes, workers' councils, ways, after all, in which you break through that kind of hierarchical thing. Why do you think, for example, the Russians rolled tanks into Prague in August of 1968? Not because a bunch of intellectuals were praying against ultra-centralism or Stalinism, but because workers had formed councils and that already threatened the whole hierarchical structure of those communist regimes. And why is it, after all, that the state in France was so anxious to buy off that May upheaval in 1968 with a few reforms that kept the hierarchical structure intact and which the French Communist Party accepted, because after all, to have broken through that kind of structure of bureaucracy, that structure of social relationships which is very unequal, is really to transform not only yourself, but in transforming yourself to transform the society. That's what Rosa Luxemburg understood. And she understood perfectly well by 1910 that it wasn't only the trade unions where the virus of opportunism and the virus of bureaucratic conservatism had infiltrated, but in the party leadership itself. When they capitulated the leadership and the apparatus at the Congress of Mannheim in 1906, when they capitulated to patriotism after the Hottentot elections of 1907, they demonstrated how frightened they were of a confrontation with the established order, how frightened they were of risking their own organizations, and how determined they were to hew to patriotic and cultural norms of the society. And consequently, Rosa Luxemburg knew where the enemy was. To fight it straight and fight it directly, and it was right at the top, at the bureaucratic top of that social democratic party. But how do you fight it? And that is the corollary to Rosa Luxemburg's insight into bureaucratic conservatism. You fight it with the mass line. It is that conviction of Rosa. It is that faith of Rosa that there are revolutionary impulses in the masses, and that under the pressure of capitalistic contradictions, they may explode in revolutionary action. The SPD cannot summon up a revolution, but in a time of imperialism, she would say by 1910, when the revolutionary situation is really beginning to gather, the party cannot afford the old routine of tactics. That what it has to do is to identify all of those tendencies and all of those conditions which could trigger mass action. And it has to explain and elucidate those tendencies to the working classes. And it has to exhort to mass action. And when mass action begins, it has to join them at once to give direction, to clarify, to enlarge, to move them to a higher plane of struggle. That was the mission of social democracy. 1910, critical for poor Rosa. And how bitter that struggle would be, she learned in that year. And how absolutely convinced the leadership and the apparatus was that it would never succumb to the mass line. Because you see, 1910 was the year that the leadership really scuttled a potential mass explosion in Germany. It started early in that year, and it was the struggle over universal suffrage for Prussia. You see, there was universal suffrage for national Reichstag elections, but each separate German state had its own election law for its own state elections. And in Prussia, the largest and dominant German state, it was the so-called three-class system that still prevailed, instituted in 1849, after the Revolution of 1848 was being liquidated to ensure conservative election results. For all of the voters in Prussia were organized into three classes according to income, so that the great mass of voters were all clustered in the third or lowest class, which was entitled to only 1/3 of the seats in the Prussian Landtag. And over and again, the SPD called for a democratization of the franchise in Prussia, so that they could get socialists into that Landtag. And on the 4th of February of 1910, the Prussian authorities, in order to fend off this campaign for universal suffrage in Prussia, brought forth a totally bogus reform which would have left the hierarchical elitist three-class system intact. And so the SPD called for street demonstrations against. And they really came. And on the 13th of February, 200,000 marched in Berlin, and scores of thousands in other Prussian cities. And day after day, the demonstrations went on until many of them were illegal because the state was trying to ban them. And in some of those provincial cities, those demonstrations for the suffrage turned into bitter economic strife. And it all culminated on the 15th of March of 1910, when there were 48 simultaneous demonstrations in Berlin alone, and meetings and strikes and demos all over the rest of Prussia. And at that point, Rosa wrote a powerful article called Was weiter? Where now? Or what next? In which she said, the party has called these demonstrations and they have been peaceful. But you can't do that forever. You have now to escalate start to change. Either the workers will get discouraged because these peaceful demonstrations will never produce unity. The vulnerable state. But then, even if they defeat, so much to be learned from that struggle. It is far better to lose a battle than for the SPD to avoid one in which the masses have already entered. And we must ask, is that then the Achilles heel in the whole body of Rosa's strategic wisdom? Do you go into any mass struggle? Isn't that really softness and spontaneity? Isn't that really a sentimentalism about the rightness of the mass? Lenin, who was no mean master of the mass line, knew perfectly well that there were times when he would not let the Bolshevik Party participate, when it seemed to him certain destruction, as in July of 1917. And Rosa herself would be the victim of exactly that kind of precipitate, premature action in January of 1919 in Berlin, when very hot-headed workers went out into the streets in the worst possible conditions, and Rosa and the fledgling German Communist Party knew that it would be destruction, knew that it would be a defeat, but could not desert those people in the street, went out with them and suffered the worst possible consequences for it. And yet I don't think you can charge Rosa just with that kind of sentiment. In the gut, she knew something that I think is irreparable. It is that there is no way in these very contemporary mass and advanced industrial societies to cope with the power of the establishment, its control over repressive forces, its capacity to divide people in society. No way except through those very rare and unusual kinds of mass confrontations, as you had in France in '68, as you had in Czechoslovakia, as you may have yet in Poland, in those moments when somehow even the tanks find themselves powerless because so many people are out. And second, that it is only in that kind of a collectivity that you scale the ideological barriers of the society. And only in such a struggle that you invent your own institution. So for the rest of that time, until 1914, it was a relentless struggle. Now Rosa understood. The party had deserted the mass strike possibilities of 1910. You know that the party daily, Goldberg, did not publish Rosa Luxemburg's article last winter. Do you know that Karl Kautsky, the keeper of the Marxist camp, would not publish it in his magazine Neue Zeit? That she had to publish that piece in an obscure little socialist newspaper in Leipzig? Do you know that the party, by the end of March of 1910, pulled back all of these demonstrations, warned the local branches against anything like that? Then, what was Rosa's tactic? Lenin would have said, split the party, walk out, make a new party. That wasn't in Rosa's. She was loyal to a party. And consequently, schism and split did not appeal. It took her a long time toward the end of her life to get to that point where she was so fed up with social democracy that she did walk out. But at this point, that faith in the people, how to break through that apparatus, that leadership, how to break through Karl Kautsky and that ever-flowing camp, you do it with the people. That you hurl the people against the leadership. The essence of her whole struggle was to find the mass, to invoke the mass, to catalyze them, to hurl them against the leadership, and to force the party to break out of the shell of electoralism and of trade unionism. And in those last years, when there was imperialism, when there was the culture of imperialism, she felt it was possible. Because you see, Guido Basso put his finger on it well. He has written certainly the most perceptive essay ever on Rosa, the Italian Basso. And Guido Basso put it well when he talked about her sense of socialism, just as Lukács did. That Rosa Luxemburg didn't have that kind of flat, schematic economic determinism that Kautsky and Plekhanov and those other good doctors, those imaginaires of the Marxist movement. That basically she had a total view of a capitalist society. All of its contradictions, in the superstructure as well as in the superstructure. Listen to what Goldberg says. She saw the totality of capitalist civilization, the full range of its contradictions, the whole cluttered landscape of its hurts, distortion, cultural and ideological aberrations. And to read her articles in that period of time, everything is grist to her mill. Just as I clip all of these things you know about gingerbread people, but she did that kind of thing because everything struck her as a profound indication of where the nuttiness in the society was, where the hurts were, where the exploitations were. Listen to what she writes, for example, about a very minor scandal in one of the poorhouses of the city of Berlin. Normal class relationships cause thousands of proletarian existences to sink into the darkness of utter misery every year. They sink silently like a deposit of used up, useless elements at the bottom of society, from which capital can no longer press out any useful juice. And at the end of all of its middle-class society hands the cup of poison to those it has evicted. Lucien Zespa, who died in the street, poisoned by rotten fish, belongs just as much to the realities of the proletariat as every qualified, highly paid worker who can afford printed New Year's cards and a golden watch chain. The asylum for the homeless and the police jails are just as much pillars of the society as the palace of the chancellor and the banks. And the poisoned fish made into gruel in the city's asylums is the basis for the caviar and the champagne on the millionaire's table. And 1,000 ways and in 1,000 pieces, she tried to dissect this. And she went to that Congress again in 1913 with her friends and urged a resolution against ever voting for a military budget was voted down. And she took to the podium everywhere, wherever they would listen to her speak. This was a woman, 5 feet tall, weighing a maximum of 110 pounds, and inexhaustible, and with a limp in one leg, and went from that podium to podium to podium, and always with the same blast against the whole imperialist system. You are paying for it. Your living standards are deteriorating. Your gruel is poisoned. You will go to war. And the crowds were getting bigger and bigger until in February of 1914, she was arrested and brought to trial for violating 2 statutes of the criminal code, aiding and abetting army desertion. And while out on appeal, until the very day the war came, because Luxemburg was on that podium, struggling to find the mass, to invoke them, to catalyze them, the answer to that bureaucratic weight in the party. Her failure is supposed to be the bottom line. But as Sean Casey once said, time is still the great